Hi everyone. One of the things that I believe is that everyone has a story, and that no matter who you are, your story is powerful. And your story is powerful because it tells you who you are. It frames your identity. And of course, we're always changing and we grow and mature, but our stories, as they grow and as they change, they shape who we are and who we are becoming. And that's what's powerful about stories. But it's not just your story telling you who you are or framing your identity. It's the bigger stories as well, these meta stories. And there's people out there, things out there that want to tell you their story, hoping to shape you. It could be the culture, it could be government, it could be your boss, your parents, marketing companies. And some of these meta stories, bigger stories, they are helpful and others less so. And I personally think that God has a story. And I believe that God's story tells us who we are meant to be. And who God's story says we are as humans might surprise you. Now, if you look at the Bible as a whole, maybe that's the last thing you ever want to do. But if you look at the Bible as a whole, I think you can see a narrative arc, a meta story, and various scholars, different people, they've divided the Bible into different parts, and they have different kind of ways of doing it. But the way I like to do it is I like to think of the big biblical story in 5 parts. And these parts are creator, rebellion, promise, true king, and new creation. So in the first part of creator, God as creator creates everything, and he makes humans in his image and everything else. And he makes things good, especially relationships. Then, the second part of God's story, there's the rebellion. Humans reject relationship with God, this good relationship with God, and they rebel against him. And in doing so, they corrupt everything, once again, especially relationships. Third part of God's story is a promise. Even though humans have rebelled, God still loves humans, and he promises to fix what they have been broken, which leads to the fourth part of God's story, which is the true king. Jesus, who's the hero of God's story, is fully human and fully God, and he comes as fulfillment of God's promise to fix what's been broken. And Jesus shows us what God is like and who humans can be. His death and resurrection start to fix everything that's been broken, especially relationships. And it leads to the final chapter, the final part of that meta-narrative arc of the Bible, which is new creation, where one day everything will be as it was meant to be, as if humans had never rebelled against God. So that's kind of like the big overview of the Bible, very brief, obviously. But if we're zooming in on part 2 of the biblical story, of God's story, and which is the rebellion, and let's see what the Bible has to say. So Genesis chapter 3, the third chapter of the Bible, things kind of go off track pretty quickly. So the third chapter, Genesis chapter 3, says this: "But the Lord God called to the man, 'Where are you?' He answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid.' And he said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?' The man said, 'The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate it.' Then the Lord God said to the woman, 'What is this that you've done?' The woman said, 'The serpent deceived me, and I ate.' So the Lord God said to the serpent, 'Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel.'" So, previous to this current series, we've looked at the story of humanity, the story of us, our identity, and how humans have a priestly identity. And we looked at how that actually comes from the first part of God's story, the first chapter of the Bible, where we take our Creator's image, or we have been made in the image of God, and we take that image that's been given to us by existing, and we present it to the rest of creation, and we develop the rest of creation, and we cultivate, and we steward, and we bring blessing, and we call that beauty and flourishing in the rest of creation. We have a priestly identity where we represent God to creation, and creation back to God. And then in part 2 of God's story, I think it shows, well, first of all, what we've just read in Genesis chapter 3, it shows how even though we were given that priestly identity, we became exploiters of each other, and we became exploiters of God's good creation when we rebelled against him. in this part, at looking at the story of us, the story of our identity as humans, we're going to look at how we are called to respond to this human rebellion and exploitation, and that we respond to it in part with our priestly identity. But there's another aspect that we really want to focus on, and that's our prophetic identity. This passage tells a story of humans having everything, including perfect relationship, and then rebelling against God and introducing corruption into God's creation, while also corrupting ourselves and the rest of creation. And the results are instantaneous. Humans become practiced at exploiting each other. It's almost like we're experts at it. Genesis chapter 3, verse 12. This is the prime example. The man said, "The woman you put here with me," this is Adam speaking to God. God has caught them, and God has sought them out. He's gone to spend time with them like it's his custom to do. And the man said, "The woman you put here, God, with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it." So the very first impact of humans rebelling against God, besides the breaking of relationship between the man and the wife, was that Adam passed blame onto Eve. And then even their children, from Cain and Abel, their sibling rivalry, which ends up in murder, from Genesis chapter 3 all the way to our present day, on where there's playground or workplace bullying or domestic violence or human trafficking or geopolitical conflict and war. All of that, the story of God, shows that humans are at the root of what is wrong in the world. But the question is, if everything is broken, if everything is corrupted, then who will speak out for truth? Who will expose the injustices? When there is emergencies, people respond to those emergencies. In a pandemic, we need healthcare workers and scientists. In a disaster, we need humanitarian aid and emergency services. In a human rebellion against the Creator, we need people with a prophetic identity. We need prophets. So when paired with our priestly identity from the first part of God's story, prophetic people from the second part of God's story, prophetic people become like healthcare workers in a pandemic. Prophetic people become God's counter-rebellion. A rebellion's taken place, corruption is spreading everywhere. Prophetic people are the answer to that corruption. Prophetic people and having a prophetic identity is God's answer to human exploitation. Genesis chapter 3, verses 14, 15. Let me read this. Just the first part of Genesis 3:14. So the Lord God said to the serpent, "And I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Often when we think about this idea of prophetic identity, which I believe is part of who we're called to be as humans, it's part of the story of us. When we think of being prophetic in Christian circles, we often think of the gift of prophecy. We think of words of encouragement and the strength to help someone keep going. Even when we think about having insight into the future, what's going to happen in the world. And we can fall into the error of flattening the idea of prophetic identity just to someone using the gift of prophecy. But prophecy is actually something deeper and more primary to our identity than just speaking words of encouragement or getting some insight into the future. I mean, that's powerful in of itself, but there's something even deeper than that in terms of prophetic identity. There's actually much more power in that common conception of prophetic words of encouragement, and even prophetic insight into the future. There's actually much more power when prophetic words of encouragement and insight into the future are joined to our prophetic identity, as God inaugurates it in Genesis chapter 3. Actually, the first prophecy in the Bible about the future comes from God's response to Adam and Eve's guilt, and God's response to not only their guilt but their shame and their efforts to hide. And he speaks about a future human, an offspring of the woman. He speaks about a future human, Jesus, and this future human, Jesus' triumph over the serpent. This is the first mention of God's plan to fix what has been broken in humanity. And it kind of falls within that popular understanding of what it means to be prophetic. It's talking about the future. So the exploitation of each other and creation, it needs to be confronted. That's what's going on here. We are called to call things out and to provide a better way to flourish. That's what Jesus does. That's what the prophetic identity in humans is meant to be. It takes courage to be the voice for the voiceless. Basically, when Adam and Eve rebel against God, when humans rebel against God, the question that needs to be asked is, who will stand up for those being picked on? Who will stand up for those who are being exploited? Who will stand up for those suffering from injustice? Exploitation and injustice, bullying, it was never meant to be part of God's creation. It wasn't found in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It was found in Genesis 3 when humans rebelled against God. So what's the answer going to be? Who will stand up for those being exploited or who are suffering from injustice? Who's going to stand up for the abused to walk free? Who will tell of God's heart and who will proclaim his character? It's God's prophetic people who paint a better picture for those who are trapped, but also, on the one hand, to those who are being exploited, but also to set those who are doing the exploitation free as well. And that's what's missed when we look at the way the world thinks about justice. Both those who are the victimizers and the victims need to be set free. And maybe the traditional model of Western Christians being the morality police, I think maybe we can say that's often been unproductive. But the key to challenging and standing up and saying, maybe that behavior is wrong, maybe the way you're treating other people is hurting you just as much as it's hurting them. Maybe rather than just saying, do this, don't do that, the key to challenging the right people and their behaviors is by spending time in God's presence, hearing God's heart, and standing up and speaking when he calls us to. And so, just as kind of like setting up the rest of this part of the story of us and looking at our identity as the Bible shows it, our prophetic identity, this third chapter of the Bible, this second part of God's story, it shows us why we need a prophetic people. Injustice and exploitation is the result of humans rebelling against God. And God foretells or prophesies that a human will defeat the serpent. And in so doing, he imbues humanity with the potential to live in a prophetic identity. People who partner with God to stand up against the brokenness and exploitation in the world. But that's just what I think. I'd love to know what you think. And I've got some questions here which I'd love to hear your answers to. So first group of questions. When you hear the word prophet, what images or roles come to mind? And how does the idea of everyone having or potentially having a prophetic identity challenge or affirm those popular images that you have? And what does being prophetic mean to you? And after hearing what I've had to say, has that changed at all? Second group of questions. What do you think of the importance of the first prophecy in the Bible being about a human defeating the serpent? What do you think of the idea that God gives his people, in response to human rebellion, an identity to confront exploitation and injustice? I think that's what God is doing when he talks about a child of an offspring of Eve defeating the serpent. And I think that's what God is doing. He's kind of unlocking the prophetic identity in humans. What do you think about that? And then finally, do you find it confronting to think that human rebellion is at the root of injustice, at the root of exploitation? Where do you see exploitation or injustice in your local context? And, maybe just reflect on this. What makes speaking up difficult when we notice that something is wrong? Anyway, love to hear your thoughts on this. Hopefully this provokes some fruitful discussion. And until next time, thanks guys.